Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the expert witnesses for coming in. Very, very helpful information. Looking back on some of the things that I've spoken about in the Dáil so far, I was kind of dismayed to see as far back as the 19th of March, I was talking about the need to address migrant workers, particularly in the case of the COVID crisis, because they were always going to become a reservoir where the disease would hang on unless it was properly treated and properly dealt with. I suppose the first question that I'd ask the witnesses is if they could give me a more complete picture of the workforce in terms of nationality that's working in the meat processing plants. So are we talking predominantly, I clearly get the picture, we're talking predominantly migrant workers. And then is there also a breakdown of the incidence rate of COVID-19, so between migrant workers who are working in those factories and then, I suppose, more workers who are more normally resident within Ireland? So could you give me kind of a fuller picture against that backdrop, please?
I'd just like to specify this. Just because workers come from a foreign country and they are considered migrant workers doesn't mean they haven't been habitually living in Ireland for a very long time. So in all the factories we have unionized, about, let's say, 90% of workers are foreign, but most of them have been living in Ireland for more than 5 years. And even though their contracts often with their agencies classify them as temporary workers so as to deprive them of their collective bargaining rights, they are not in fact temporary workers. They are people who live in Ireland like Irish citizens who live here all year round, who have been working in the same jobs for 10 years. So I would say it's not a workforce in transit or seasonal in any way. It is a permanent workforce which happens to be foreign and quite vulnerable and marginalised.
Thanks, Ms. Labo. I suppose I was aiming the question more at the idea.
Deputy Clerk, can I just deal with what exactly you've asked? We across our 6,000 plus members in the primary, and particularly in the primary meat processing industry, you can have workplaces with 6, 7 different languages, as my colleagues will testify to, where all of the necessary information has not been given them in their mother tongue, which is a problem. You asked about how many within the migrant category. It's interesting, when Meat Industry Ireland, and I watched the last time they addressed this committee, and they may be here today, I found it ironic that Eastern European workers, although they have free access of movement across the EU, are not recognised by Meat Industry Ireland as migrant workers. Now, I think that's a spin. So you've got workers from South Africa, a lot of Brazilian workers from South America, and you've got a lot of Eastern European workers. And as my colleague has said, some of them are here for many, many years. The virus, as you know, doesn't discriminate on ethnicity grounds. It doesn't discriminate inside or outside of the employment. So I'd say, you know, when I first represented meat workers, and I haven't represented them for a long time, and that was over 20 years ago in Kildare, I'd say the ratio was 80% Indigenous and 20% migrant. It's now 70% migrant and 30% Indigenous. So you are going to have pro rata more cases of workers, but because of the vectors of the cramped living conditions, the carpooling that workers are forced into. Because in 2016, the then government in its programme said that they would have the minimum wage up to $10.50 at this stage. It's still at $10.10. Now, that's nowhere near it. The living wage is nowhere near it. We need to be moving these workers up towards an average industrial wage because of the labour-intensive work that they provide, by everyone's admission, to an essential service.
Thank you very much. My second question is in relation to sick pay provision. So, well, it's been outlined that 90% of the workers that we're talking about don't have sick pay provision. But I suppose I wanted to talk specifically in terms of language context and difficulty in accessing things. Have workers been able to access the PUP payments, or has there been a large lag time where workers have been left without any payment at all owing to COVID-19 sicknesses?
Yes, so actually, in fact, for a lot of these workers, especially for the agency workers, sometimes the agencies were actively trying to discourage them from applying for the COVID-19 illness benefit and trying to make them apply for the pandemic unemployment payment while they were actually self-isolating while being ill. We do not know the reasons for this. We suspect that it is because they didn't want any clusters to show up. Also, often it is our union and often myself who has had to help workers in providing them the forms, filling them in for them, and so on, because their employment agencies for the foreign workers have made no effort in helping them have access to any of these payments that they were entitled to while ill and self-isolating at home. And actually, this even happened of workers being sort of actively discouraged from seeking the illness benefit even when there was a huge financial difference at the beginning of the pandemic between the unemployment payment, which was still at 203 euros a week, and the illness benefit, which was at 350. And so the agency kept trying to force people to apply for the unemployment payment, just so that cluster wouldn't appear in that area, probably wouldn't show up in the
Abo, is it falling mainly to representatives like yourself to do that translation work?
Yes, I've done it a lot, but I think that also the employers should have been supportive of their own staff and should have at least directed people on how to find these forms. Like a lot of the forms, for instance, for the COVID-19 illness benefit weren't online for the most part of March when we had some early clusters, and many people did not have GPs because they hadn't had the PPS number, because they had been scammed by their employment agency. So they were in a very difficult situation, and their agency and the hirer, so I mean the factory owner, did not help their staff in any way, just send them home where they were self-isolating without supplies, and they were desperate, and it's only because they were unionized that we could help them. So we do not know if other workers who were not unionized actually went through a whole ordeal without even accessing any payment. And then there were actually very long delays in accessing this payment, and because the workers have no English, it was very hard for them to contact like the Department of Social Welfare to see how their application was going. So for instance, we have the case of 6 workers who only received the payment for the 2 weeks they self-isolated it in March. They only received it now like in July.